We are back again to attempt another version of the newspaper guitar, but this time we're going to try and use a 3D mold to create a pattern within the newspaper wood. On the previous version, the newspaper was just laminated in straight strips, and I noticed that it looked a bit like a wood grain, just a very straight wood grain. So we're changing the approach here to get more of that wood grain look, but hopefully more of a patterned wood grain appearance opposed to just the straight grain of the previous version. So with that said, the first step here is to create our 3D mold, and we're creating a sort of spiral star pattern which should give the blank a pretty cool looking grain. We've got 30 pounds of newspaper misprints that we picked up from our local newspaper, which is awesome because it's free. Then we're using a slow cure resin to laminate each sheet with each other. We started off with just a small amount of layers just to make sure our process even works. This is a peel ply which will stop the vacuum bag from sticking to the newspaper, and this is a bleeder cloth which should soak up any additional resin that gets squeezed out. This is only about 25 layers of newspaper, which obviously isn't enough to create an entire guitar blank, but if this works we can stack our next layer on top of this. Peel ply and bleeder cloth get placed on, and the whole thing gets put in the vacuum bag. Bag gets sealed and we pull a vacuum on it. Simple as that. And ideally this will press the newspaper completely into the mold and give us our pattern.
Huge bumps.
Unfortunately, we noticed that we were getting some pretty severe creasing in the tighter portions of the mold, which we had kind of expected to happen. So we pulled it all out and gave the newspaper a few cuts, which should help reduce those creases. Put it back in the bag and pulled a vac on it again, and it seemed to be forming to the mold quite a bit better. So we let it cure overnight and pulled it out the next morning to see what we've got. We're still getting some pretty bad creasing all over this thing. I think the pattern might just be a little too complex for what we're trying to do here. This side's also got just a lot of creases. As per usual in our projects, we pivoted to a new plan where we reduced the overall height of the pattern, which should make it easier to form. Essentially just making the mounds and angles within the mold more smooth so there's no edges for the newspaper to crease at. Then Packard spray painted the mold, buffed it up with some steel wool, waxed it with some parting wax, and created a tape dam around the edge of the mold. This is a PVA mold release that's getting applied to the mold. Then we're going to chop up some fiberglass and use that along with some resin to create an opposite male side of the mold. The resin we're using here has been forgotten in our shop, which over the years in the hot summers turned it yellow, so it was kind of an unusable resin anyways, at least on anything that needed to be poured clear. So it came in handy for this part of the project, and that is something to keep in mind. If you've got resin, you want to store it somewhere that's at least somewhat climate controlled, because if it's left in a hot shop or garage, it will turn bad on you over time. The fiberglass strips are just added into the mold to increase the overall strength, since we'll be using this mold to press our newspaper instead of the original plan of using the vacuum bag. So now we've got our two-piece 3D mold, which we'll use to press the newspaper, and we lined both sides of the mold with Tyvek tape just to make sure that the newspaper won't stick to it. And we got back to rolling resin onto newspaper sheets. We won't be able to do all the sheets all at once, so we're doing about 200 sheets per day since this takes a very long time to laminate. Rigged up our mold on some 2x4s along with some angle iron brackets and some threaded rod that we can use to help press the molds together. Since the mold is slightly smaller than the newspaper sheets, we first had to cut the newspaper to the size of the mold before pressing it. And in hindsight, it would have been way easier if we had just made the mold slightly larger. Dang. Dangerous. Is that a part of the plan?
No. What if I just screw it to it?
Screws down like the corners?
Yeah.
That's probably the best way. This is the whole process just to make the first ½ inch or so of our blank. So we'll have to do this another 8 to 10 times in order to get the blank thick enough for a guitar build. If we get the blank to around 4 inches thick, then at that point it'll be thick enough to where we can route the blank flat and still have about a 2-inch thick guitar blank, which is pretty standard. Now the laminated newspaper gets put onto one half of the mold and sandwiched between the other half. Use the threaded rods to clamp down the edges and a few car jacks to press down the middle. The car jacks were leaking pressure slowly over time, so we ended up swapping those out for just a simple threaded rod setup, which won't lose pressure over time like the jacks. Let it cure overnight and then hammered the two halves apart the next day to see how our blank was looking.
Looks pretty good.
Pretty good.
A couple little things.
It'd be like wormholes in wood.
Yeah.
First layup was overall a success, so we went ahead and laminated another 200 sheets on top. The resin from the first lamination wasn't completely set, which is why we don't have to sand the surfaces before applying this layer. Then over the course of another 5 days, we continued on with opening up the mold and laminating another 200 sheets at a time until our blank was thick enough for us to call it quits. With each consecutive lamination, the mold became increasingly difficult to split apart, which is why we're using wedges here to get it split. Now that we've got our patterned newspaper blank, we now need to router plane the whole thing down flat, and doing so should leave us with a star patterned newspaper blank that is flat and that we can build our guitar out of.
Is it coming out? Is it looking as cool as you were hoping?
Didn't imagine the grain pattern would be quite so tight, which is, in hindsight, kind of dumb. I think
It is really. It almost looks like a fingerprint.
One thing that's kind of interesting here is the white strip that goes down the center, and that white strip is because of the blank sections in the middle of the newspaper sheets, the spots without any images or text. And since we laminated each sheet the same direction, it left us with that white strip down the middle. It's not really a bad thing, just something we didn't really anticipate, and kind of interesting.
You think it looks good there?
I don't know, dude. I hate this part.
I think you'll look good.
After much thought on where to cut out the body on the blank, we settled with the white line running down the center of the body, which basically gives us the star pattern perfectly centered on the body. And as of this point in the build, the star pattern and the newspaper grain in general isn't very clear, but once we get this thing sanded and finished, it should all be pretty visible. Now we're kind of in the home stretch with this build, just turning this thing into a guitar, which for most guitar builds is the entire process. But since we're typically using weird materials, the creation of the blank is really the most time-intensive process of the entire project. Packard's been mostly building the entire blank and guitar body for this project as I was working on other stuff, but I am going to be building the neck for this guitar. And for the neck, I've got a nice piece of roasted bird's eye maple, and I'm going to keep the neck build fairly short here, considering most of you have probably seen me build a lot of these things in previous projects. There's nothing really too special going on with this neck. Threaded inserts in the heel, two-way truss rod, pretty much standard stuff for all of my necks. We used some of the newspaper blank offcuts to create a cavity cover for the back of the body so that we'll have a match there. Added a round over to the body and also carved in a belly cut on the backside, which will, one, reduce the weight of the guitar a bit, but it'll also give a cool look to the pattern or wood grain or newspaper grain, whatever you want to call it, because you'll sort of get a stretched appearance where this carve is. Pretty good tape pull.
Not bad.
We also carved in an arm bevel on the top of the body, which will also give that same look as the belly carve. Drilling some holes for the electronics in the body. Got a little pressure explosion there because I wasn't backing out the drill bit enough. Applied some hard wax oil to the neck, which will give it a nice satin finish, which in my opinion feels really good for a guitar neck, but it still brings out the grain to show it off. And for the body, I also went with a hard wax oil finish, which just gets wiped on and wiped off. It's one of the easiest finishes to apply. I thought about going with a high gloss urethane finish, but I really liked how I could see the grain with an oil finish, whereas a urethane finish is going to fill in the grain and give a more glass-like looking finish. So I ultimately decided on this finish, and I think it came out looking really good. It's pretty much exactly what I was aiming for. Hit the body with a bit of wax and a quick buff just to bring up the shine a tad. Then got all the hardware and electronics installed in the body. Went with a push-pull volume pot so we can coil split on the humbuckers. And at the end of the video, I'll get you guys a weight on this guitar since that's always a point of curiosity. And of course I'll play a demo, but for now, here's how this thing ended up looking. I think one of the best looking guitars we've built in the shop. It's kind of to the level where if you're just seeing it from a distance, you wouldn't be able to, you would just think it's a wooden guitar. But obviously if you come up close to it, you can see all the different layers and kind of the grain of the newspaper. If you get this thing in the right lighting, you can really start to see that grain come through, which is pretty cool. Let's get a weight on this thing. 11.25 pounds. So it's heavy, but definitely not the heaviest I've built. This thing's set up super well. It plays really good. It is going to be listed on our site for sale, along with some other guitars that are up there. So if you're interested in checking that out, the link to that will be in the description. Other than that, I'm going to play a demo on this and end the video. Thanks for watching.